Well, the first two episodes covered video game weapons, so now it's time to look at some Hollywood nonsense, namely from the first Highlander movie. There is one sword that is just ridiculously stupid, and that is the Kurgan sword. If you just look at it at first glance, it doesn't seem to be too bad, just based on the overall shape. Sure, it has the typical fantasy sword ailments that plague so many others as well. It seems a bit like an orc with arthritis made it, because, it's kind of bulky overall. It's thicker than it should be. It's wider in places. So it seems like that the maker just wasn't skilled enough to make a more refined piece, if you will. Like the guard, for instance. If you look at that thing, the guard is just very wide. And by wide, I mean in the direction of the length of the blade. Not this direction, that will be fine, but it doesn't have to be that wide. It's really completely unnecessary. This is much more reasonable. If you make the guard overly large, you just add extra material that doesn't benefit you in any way. But, you could at least fix it the way it is. Like, you could grind it down some more to make it lighter, more reasonable, and more agile in the hand. I know, people just keep talking about how the characters have superhuman strength and they can just wield them easily. But if you increase the velocity, not only are you more effective in a fight, increased velocity also increases the amount of damage that you do. So just making it heavier is never a good idea, really. So, like I said, you could at least fix that. Also, it has the typical round grip that is much less practical in terms of handling than an oval grip. But again, at least you could fix that. But there is one really severe problem with that sword in the movie. Now, before I comment on that, let me just talk briefly about the spikes at the guard, because that's of course also a prominent feature. There were actually historical parrying daggers that had spring-loaded secondary quillons, if you will, that did fold out sideways on the press of a button, but they were designed to be used against light blades, rapiers mainly. But if you were to use something like that against a wider, heavier blade with point of balance further away from the guard, like the kind of swords that they use in the movie, they wouldn't hold up very well, simply because they are only attached at the guard. What makes a sword sturdy overall is that it's mainly one piece, all the way from the point to the pommel. If you don't know how they were assembled historically, the blade just transitions into the tang here that goes all the way through the grip and through the pommel, and then the final part sticks out and that is hammered down to secure everything. So the entire thing is basically one piece. Just the two extra pieces are the pommel and the guard. And those are also the pieces that come loose whenever it's not very high quality, whenever it's poorly assembled, simply because they are not attached as firmly. It's not just one piece that distributes the entire force all along itself whenever it's hit. So if they are just attached here, you can imagine that a vigorous strike on them will just loosen them up and eventually they might just break off. But then again, as soon as they have broken off, you can just use it normally. So it's not that big of a deal. It does add a bit of unnecessary extra weight, but yeah, as soon as they're broken off, it doesn't really matter anymore. So you could fix those things, but let's return to the one thing that is irredeemably broken about this sword design. Namely, there is an infamous scene in the movie where the Kurgan actually assembles the sword out of individual pieces. And the problem with that is the blade comes in two pieces as well. Yeah, that's all he does. Just click, shoving the pieces together, that's it. They weren't satisfied simply with designing a sword that would handle sluggishly like a crowbar. If that was the only problem, you could still use that sword to strike something. But they couldn't have that. That would have been way too practical. They had to design it in such a way that whenever you strike something, it's just gonna shatter into pieces. In fact, even before you hit something, if you have a sword that is made of two parts that are just shoved into one another with about that much overlapping. And there's nothing to secure them, only friction, basically, that's holding them in place. As soon as you swing that thing, guess what's going to happen? The top part is going to fly out into space. Well, not that far, hopefully, but you can imagine. There's just nothing that would secure it. Let alone the fact that if you were actually to receive an opponent's sword strike onto the blade, it's just going to snap right off. This piece where they are joined, that will absorb all of the force that goes into the blade. And of course also it won't be able to flex very well, which a sword blade should in order to not shatter. I mean, I know it's all just for entertainment and suspension of disbelief and blah blah blah. I know, but even so, I mean, what is the target audience? Like 10-year-olds on meth? Even with suspension of disbelief, there comes a point when something just becomes so ludicrous that it's just ridiculous and pathetic, quite frankly. The movie did take itself pretty seriously, and they use those swords in deadly combat, so just waving a hand, dismissing it as, oh, it doesn't have to be functional, it's just a movie. Well, if they're fighting with the stuff in the movie, with the amount of magic required to hold such a nonsensical, weak assembly together, you might as well just make a completely magical, ethereal blade that doesn't have any of those problems. Basically like the magic equivalent of a lightsaber. And by the way, just as a side note, I find it very funny when people defend something like that as, oh, it's just entertainment and don't be so harsh on it, blah, blah. And then they proceed to criticize this kind of video, which is for entertainment purposes. So if you're not supposed to criticize entertainment whatsoever, then shut up. The funny thing is there is actually a reproduction of the Kurgan sword, which is made by United Cutlery, and that is a company that is known for making wall hangers, just purely decorative, non-functional sword-like objects that are made of cheap, brittle stainless steel, and that if you were to use them to strike something, they would just break. But even United Cutlery has made the reproduction in one piece. Even they have realized that the two-part construction is completely ludicrous and flimsy and just impossible. So that tells you something. There can only be one. Well, if you're stupid enough to use one of these in a deadly duel, your cognitive ability or lack thereof is certainly unique, so one of a kind, I'll give you that.